Thanks, everyone. So we, of course, today have with us Tom Fishburne. You probably know him best as the founder and CEO of the Marketoonist. Tom's work here is so prolific that I tend to receive the latest cartoon kind of several times over in my inbox from him as part of Marketing Week subscription and splashed across my LinkedIn. And his cartoons have also been known to feature in the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, and the New York Times, plus twice on billboard ads in Times Square. Just in case anyone isn't familiar with Tom's work, or just to get us all in the zone for today's conversation, I am going to share with you a couple of my personal favourites that I have picked out. Let me just, you get a sneak peek. I think we've all seen a lot of AI recently, so this one I think sums it up perfectly. Been talking a lot about brand guidelines recently in my current company, and this one definitely resonated. Love a good wedding. This is wedding marketing style. And finally, as a marketeer, this has definitely rung true at moments throughout my career. I'm sure you'll all have some personal favourites, and we will talk through some of Tom's at the end. So in terms of today, it may not surprise you, given the on-the-nose nature of Tom's work, that he has a lot of marketing experience of his own, including as interim chief marketing officer at Hotel Tonight, managing director for international at Method, and experience in brand management for Nestle and General Mills. And if creating the world's most famous marketing cartoons every week wasn't enough, Tom also keeps himself busy as a frequent international keynote speaker on innovation, marketing, and digital transformation, develops custom campaigns for businesses including Adobe, Dell, IBM, and Deloitte, and is a repeat lecturer on humour in business at Harvard Business School. Tom, welcome to Marketing Kind.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. So great to see all of you.
So Tom and I are going to have a chat for about 40 minutes, and then we'll hand over to all of you for your questions. So please get your thinking caps on. Today, we're going to be discussing all things humour and the role it can play in driving change in the workplace and society more broadly. But before we get into that, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to hear directly from you, Tom, more about the journey of the Marketoonist. So take us back to the start. How did it all come about?
Oh, wow. It was a bit accidental. So I'd always loved cartoons since I was a kid, and I used to draw all the time, but I didn't really do anything with it. And I thought it was just a hobby. I was frankly a little too shy to share my drawings with other people. And it wasn't until business school, strangely enough, that I started drawing cartoons. We had a student newspaper, and I would just kind of play around doodling in the margins. And a friend of mine was the editor of the school paper and said, asked me if I would contribute something. And the idea of sharing it in front of everybody in a newspaper terrified me, but he wouldn't let up. And I finally did. And I got hooked. I showed up to the next class after the paper had come out, and I'd kind of made fun of that particular class. And the professor started off the class by putting it up on the overhead for everyone to see. And there was this moment of panic because I looked up and saw my work up there. And then people started laughing, and it just kind of hooked me. So that was sort of the start of it. I got hooked and drew this student cartoon for 2 years. And then when I graduated, I didn't have a student newspaper anymore. And I went to go work at General Mills. And I realized a lot of the same dynamic was present in my work life, that there were these inside jokes, things we were all kind of going through together. It was sort of this communal experience. And there was just too much going around not to make fun of it. So I started drawing the cartoons just a little over 20 years ago. And initially sent it out to 35 or so associate marketing managers at General Mills who I worked with, and just said, hey, I've had this cartoon going on in business school. I thought I would start this new cartoon about marketing. If you're interested, here's how you sign up. And then I was really surprised that within a week or two, I had people signing up from all over the world, all these different marketing companies. And it just snowballed from there. Initially, it was just an email newsletter. And that's still really the core of what I do is this email newsletter. And then over time, when blogging sort of picked up, I started writing a short article to go along with each cartoon, and then social media expanded it, and it just kind of snowballed. And I didn't expect this ever to become my career. I thought it would just be my hobby and my sideline. And then I started to get requests from all these marketing people who were reading my cartoons and asked if I could create cartoons for their marketing campaigns, or they're trying to communicate something at work. At one point, I had an executive contact me from Google who asked if I would draw a bunch of cartoons about the Google culture, but leave out the fact that she had personally commissioned me to draw these cartoons so that she could take these cartoons to her leadership team and say, hey, these are some cultural things we need to work on. So it was quite funny playing, just seeing how humor could pop up in different cultures. And I made the full-time jump to do this full-time about 13 years ago. 13 years ago this last month. My wife and I started it as a full-time studio, and a lot of I still publish the weekly cartoon on marketing, and then the business model is really creating custom work and doing a lot of speaking, which I hadn't expected. I travel a lot and speak at conferences around the world on marketing and using cartoons to do it. So that's a bit of how I ended up here. It's a serendipitous journey I didn't quite expect at the start, but it's amazing how it's come to turn into something that I really love. And I love connecting with marketing people all over the world who are going through similar things. It's a reminder that we're all going through it together.
I think we've got some interference. Are we all good? Beautiful.
I'm all good. I heard an echo there at the end, but I wasn't sure if that might have been me.
It was not you, I don't think. What made you take the jump 13 years ago to do this full time?
I kind of got to this point. I was, actually when I first started thinking seriously that the cartoons could be more than just my hobby. Ironically, I was living in England. I'd helped bring an American brand to the UK. And 2008 happened, and suddenly everything was up for grabs, and it was unclear if we were going to keep the office open, and it was unclear, if I would have a job, if I would have a return ticket back to the US. And so I felt very sort of exposed because I had a young family living in London, and suddenly it was all up for grabs. And so I'd been getting all these requests to do things with cartoons, as a business, and a lot of them I sort of pushed off to the side. And suddenly I thought, wow, maybe I'll lean into this. It's one thing that I could actually do and just do it as a sideline. And so that had started in 2008. And then I got to this point in 2010 or 2009, where I was back in the US, and I was trying to decide kind of where to go from here. And the cartoons had so much momentum. I got to a point finally where I couldn't do both. I had so much client stuff coming through. I was sort of at a point of no return. I had to choose. It was hard. There's a brand in Wales called Hyatt Denim. David Hyatt is one of the founders. He and his wife Claire, and they had this event. They still do in Wales called the Do Lectures. And I went once when I was living and working in England. And the whole idea of this Ideas Festival was to challenge you to think about what you want to do with your life, and go do it. And I had this moment of clarity there at this event that, gosh, I really want to make this a big part of my life someday. So that kind of had nestled in my brain. And so I couldn't let it go once I decided I wanted to make something happen with that. And he had this analogy that he shared in the conference that always resonated with me, that if you're trying to decide whether to start a business, there's never a right time to make that entrepreneurial leap. But he said that there's this analogy that helped him, where if you're a plane on a runway and you're cruising down the runway about to take off, there's this point called V1 speed, where you kind of either take off or you crash. It's sort of the point of no return. And so his analogy was, imagine yourself on a runway, and then imagine what your V1 marker would be. Like, what would have to be true in order for you to actually take that jump and make the leap. And so I started reflecting on that and thinking, what would be true? I have a young family and a mortgage and all this stuff, but I could actually make a leap, take the jump if I have these criteria met. And one of them was that, my cartoon kind of income was half my salary, was sort of a threshold, and then a few other things like that. And then I kind of hit this point. I was like, oh my gosh, I met my V1 marker. It's time for me to make the jump. And so I did, and it was terrifying. But my wife and I made the jump together October of 2010.
I know from our conversations previously that you have a really small team, despite the fame of the billboard, the New York Times Square billboards, and that's quite a deliberate choice. I think it might be quite interesting for some of our members to hear more about that, and your wife as well. What's that like? Small team, including wife.
I feel so lucky I get to work with my wife, but we had to figure out our like work relationship, which is different than a married relationship. And we had to kind of draw some healthy boundaries, including, when one of us is brushing our teeth is not the right time to talk about whether an invoice has been paid. They're just some
Very
clear
wise.
sort of boundaries.
Yes.
But once we figured that out, it's been a wonderful way to work together and to have flexibility in our family life. At one point, we thought about building a whole agency. There's so much cartoonist talent out there, and I thought we could bring up like a stable of cartoon talent. And I experimented with some things along those lines, but I found that I was suddenly turning into a project manager, and I wasn't getting to do enough of the creativity myself. And so I decided kind of pretty early on that I would keep it primarily focused on projects where I could be personally involved all the way through, and occasionally bring in great talent here and there. We'll do like animation, for instance. I'm not an animator. There are great talented animators out there, but I can partner with animators. But I wanted to be the primary cartoonist, and I found that worked best with the organizations that came to me, because they often would contact me because they knew my work over here, and they didn't want to suddenly have it look totally different. Like they liked that it looked like my style. And so I realized that I could play to my strengths, and I didn't have to scale. That actually the ideal sort of size for my wife and I was to keep the business pretty bespoke and small, and really cherry pick the types of clients we work with. And that's led to a great quality of life. So that choice has worked out really well.
There's more pressure with that for you to always come up with the cartoons. Do you ever get cartoonist block, if that's such a phrase? Do they just come naturally?
That's such a great question, because I was terrified about that, actually. I thought, what would happen if I hit that point. And I remember meeting a cartoonist who was a kind of a daily editorial cartoonist. So he had a daily deadline every day. And I talked to him about exactly that question. And he said, he used to think of ideas as like drawing from a well, that you're going to pull ideas from the well, and then one day it would just be dry. And then he learned that when he started doing this every day for a living, that it was actually more like a muscle, that if you exercise it regularly and you put the right kind of priorities in place to make sure you're exercising your creative mind regularly, that the ideas just sort of come. And that became the real process for me. It was a shift, because before, when this was just a hobby, my output was one cartoon a week, and that's pretty easy. I'd just be in a room somewhere, in a conference room, and somebody would say something silly, and I would think that would make a good cartoon idea. But when suddenly my output was more like, I generate probably 30 to 40 cartoon ideas every week, and then narrow them down to which ones I ink. I had to be more systematic about it. And so I kind of scheduled it like exercise. I block a chunk of time every day where I have a process I follow. And it's sort of like, here's when I'm exercising, and my job is not to have the most brilliant cartoons at the end of it. It's just to sit in the chair and do the work and play around with ideas and not have distractions. And I found that as long as I did that and just trusted the process, not every session is the most productive on earth. But if I do that, 5 days in a row in a work week, by the end of the week, I generally have a lot of ideas to work with. So that's been the process for me. And I think if I ever went back to an office environment, I would approach my work a little bit like that too. I'd make sure I had some dedicated deep thinking time, because I found that if I'm not careful in a lot of my life, I'm led by my inbox. Whatever anybody happens to be sending me, that becomes my to-do list. And then I never have the time for the deep thinking and the creativity. And so I've learned, because I've been doing this for a while, I really hold that time sacred.
I think that is definitely, I can see some nods around. There's definitely something that resonates with a lot of people, whether it's a creative output or more of a strategic thinking work output. So yeah, really interesting tips. Thank you so much for sharing. I'd like to move across to humour now a little bit. And again, starting pretty broad, how do you define humour? What does humour mean to you?
Oh, God, great question. I think I love this old vaudeville expression that laughter is the shortest distance between two people. This idea that I think when there are a lot of different varieties of humor. Yeah. And I've learned over time that some are appropriate in certain environments and some aren't. And they're all innately human. I mean, they're all parts of the human experience. But I came across an academic a few years ago who broke up 4 primary types of humor that really helped me think about it. And they were kind of laid out on a little bit of like an empathy scale. Like there's an aggressive form of humor, kind of a shock comedian, and that can be funny in certain contexts. But then there's, it's kind of laughing at someone. And then there's a laughing with someone, scale. So I think about that scale. And then I also think about whether it's outward focused or inward focused, like is it towards something else, or is it laughing at myself or laughing with others? The laughing with others model of humor, that little quarter, is the one I've realized I really spark to the most naturally. It's sort of a collective kind of laughing together. The academics call it affiliative humor. And so I tend to focus there because there's a real bonding effect that can happen when a group is going through something together, some kind of experience. And humor often comes through some sort of a pain point, something that's kind of not quite working. If you can laugh at it together, it can be really cathartic. It's bonding. That came naturally for me because I was starting this as like working in General Mills and with a marketing team.
Yeah.
And I used to send out the cartoons in the workday. And so I would be in a floor and I would hit send, and it might relate to something we'd all been going through the previous week. And suddenly, like people would get the email, and then occasionally, like people would like pop their heads up and want to talk about it. A friend of mine described it as prairie dogging, kind of like prairie dogs sticking their heads out of
yeah, or meerkatting.
And I always like that analogy because it was a collective thing. There was a bonding aspect to it. So that my sense of humor through my cartoons was kind of linked with that experience, and I find that now that's what I look for. I love it when people write me a note and say that it feels like I'm spying on them at work, because it makes me feel like we're all going through something together. And if there's ever a butt of the joke, it's usually me. It's usually something I've gone through, like I'm struggling how to make sense of AI, or I'm struggling, like, I don't understand NFTs and why is everybody talking about it all the time? Things like that come up. And it's something that I'm struggling with. And then I draw a cartoon about it and people come back and say, oh yeah, that's funny, or this is what I'm going through. And there's something collective about it. So that's, I don't have a definition of humor per se, but that's where I tend to steer, is that type of direction. And the other aspect of that I really like is that humor can help us hold up a mirror to things that might be hard to talk about another way. Like I find that sometimes something will go along and will be happening in society or in our workplace, and we all notice it, but we don't really have a way to talk about it. Because if you just bring it up, it can be seen as too aggressive, or we don't want to rock the boat or whatever. And I find that humor can give us a little bit of permission to do that. So that's the other aspect I like. There's a bit of I think it's a good tool in any sort of leadership kind of business environment if we use it appropriately. But it's often underappreciated in work, I think.
And do you think that's quite unique to humor, that ability? Can you think of anything else that can enable to cut through some of that awkwardness or that unspoken truth? Or is humor quite unique in its ability to kind of fill that gap and bring those things to the fore?
I feel like it's unique. I mean, there are definitely other ways to get across, something that's happening, and just, you can hold up the mirror, but people can get quite defensive, and it's hard to do it appropriately. And so I think, again, that affiliative humor, like here's a situation, you get people laughing at it. I think there's something really, really powerful about that. I think that people, particularly in work environments, are often very reluctant to use humor. There's a fear that it's going to misfire, for good reason. Humor can sometimes, we all see examples of ways that humor does backfire. But by and large, most of the times I see humor backfiring in the workplace is when it's gone out of that affiliative space into an aggressive space. Or you're the butt of the joke, what you're making fun of, that it's an attack as opposed to, hey, let's laugh at something we're all going through. That's most of the time of what I see. But because of that, I think that people can be very reluctant to even go there. I do this experiment sometimes or frequently when I speak in a company conference or a kind of a work event, where I'll send out a cartoon without a caption, and I ask people just to supply a caption. And I'm always amazed, like before the event, like what the response rate looks like. And sometimes people get really excited about it, and sometimes there's a reluctance to contribute, or they'll send a caption, but they'll say they want to be anonymous, they don't want to be attached to it. And I feel like when I then go meet the organizations and spend time with them, I can kind of pick up on the culture, and I feel like there's sort of I can tell the cultures where people feel open and comfortable being humorous, being themselves. I think it's a sign of being yourself with your colleagues too. Cultures that are like that, I feel like, have a certain vibe about them. And those that feel I don't want people to see this side of me, have a different vibe about them. And my personal belief is that those that feel like you can be your true self when you show up at work, and the leadership sets a tone that it's okay to laugh at what we do, that leads to, it's certainly a place I'd rather work. And I feel like it can lead itself to better, idea transfer and innovation and those types of things. I feel like as if you're in a leadership role, trying to create more of that type of culture can be better and more conducive to getting the best out of people. And I've gotten to meet a lot of executives who really try to think about humor as part of their leadership approach. Just over time, people have contacted me, and it's kind of natural gravitation. And I think it's an underappreciated skill, and something that I think we could all do a bit more of.
And how do some of those leaders go about doing it? If you haven't got Tom Fishburne coming in to run a session and share cartoons, how can, and maybe you're not a cartoonist yourself, how can a leader in an organization or of a team start to bring humor in? What might that look like?
Yeah, great question. I don't think it means that we have to suddenly all be stand-up comedians. Like, we all have different aspects and approaches and styles. But I think that we can set a tone and say that, it's okay to laugh at the situation. Sometimes if you're in a leadership role and one person on your team, is kind of naturally funny, find places for that person to shine and show that it's okay that we're doing this. I had a chance a few years ago to participate in a new course offering at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. There are two professors there who created the first ever MBA level course of humor in business. And it was a really fun experience because it was actually being instructed. And over the course of the I kind of expected we would show up and everybody would be funny or they would be teaching you jokes, but it wasn't that at all. It was often some very simple steps. That one of the first assignments that they gave students was to take some email they had sent in the previous week. And a lot of them were executive MBAs, so they were working a day job.
At the same time.
So take an email they sent out, and then they would give the challenge. Now rewrite this as if you're actually a human. And the idea was realizing that it's so often in business, we talk a certain way, we communicate a certain way, that we would never actually talk to our friends in that way. And oftentimes, and when you rewrite it with just more humanness, the natural humor can show up and it can be much more effective. And so that was like very simple baby steps in that direction. They by the end of the course, the final assignment was to pick some story in your life and tell it in a humorous way. So they did actually get up in front of the class and tell a story. But, it was a wide range. It wasn't everybody turned into, a comedian, but it was natural and human. And that was, I guess, the biggest thought for me, is to try to find ways to be find more human moments. If you have an all hands meeting or something like that, to show up with some of that, because it sets a tone. And then I think when senior leadership is doing it, then people further down are more comfortable doing it too.
Beyond the cartoons, is that something that you were able to bring to your job in your 20 years of marketing? Do you feel you brought humor to the workplace day to day as well?
I really tried to. I would often bring cartoons into my day job when I wasn't working with teams. Like that was something that I kind of leaned into a little bit. But yeah, I would try to. We had one of the organizations I worked with was called Method, and it was a consumer products company. And we had in the San Francisco head office, we decided that we would no longer have a front kind of desk receptionist. And instead, everybody in the entire company would take turns being the receptionist for like 2 or 3 days a year. And the idea was that, you get to be partnered with somebody you might not otherwise work with. And you spend the day, greeting the UPS driver and any guests who come. And it's kind of like a fun, it was sort of a bonding experience. But pretty early on, we started all showing up in costumes. It just became part of the thing. And it was really fun. And it let us feel comfortable doing that. So you'd be matched up with somebody in supply chain or accounting you wouldn't otherwise work with on a day-to-day basis. And then you're picking a costume together and you're kind of letting your guard down. And it really set a tone. It set a tone when people would show up to the office. They were like, this place is a little bit different, but it set a tone internally because there's a little bit of one-upmanship, like how can we be funny in this way? And so that I learned a lot kind of in my various leadership roles about how humor could like kind of break down some of those boundaries. Because I think one of the things that holds businesses back, and the biggest way in an organization is thinking in silos. And particularly when companies grow, they get bigger, they think in silos. And if you can find ways to kind of break down some of the silo walls, and humor can be a great way to do it, then the next time you're sitting down, you're actually talking about developing a new product or a marketing campaign or whatever, you have some of that common trust and humanness about it.
Corporate culture is quite a lot about, or the traditional corporate culture is quite a lot about fitting in. And it's interesting, something you said before was that humor can make you more vulnerable or make you bring yourself to work. How do you, if a business is more on that traditional corporate side, what are the benefits of bringing in humor or letting people be more relaxed in that way at work?
I think that, I mean, larger businesses in particular already have a lot of safety nets, but I think that people can sometimes join a large organization. I know I have. And because of the fitting in component, you end up self-editing, self-policing, keeping ideas to yourself. And that creates this monoculture environment where the best thinking just doesn't even get shared. At its extreme sense, it's that way. I experienced it personally when I was an intern. I'd been drawing this cartoon in business school. I show up at General Mills as an intern, and I'm so aware of what the culture is there. And I never worked in a place quite that large before, and I was worried that I wouldn't, my analytical skills wouldn't be so sharp, as strong as everybody else's. So I was just constantly aware. And at the end of the summer, I got my performance review for the summer, and they were complimentary, and they ended up offering me a full-time job, but they gave me kind of like development areas. And one of them was, you're not very creative. And I was like, actually, kind of, that's my thing. Like, I've been drawing this cartoon. And I kind of think of myself as creative. And he said, a lot of people think that, but you're just not very creative. And I realized, it was actually a fair assessment because I hadn't shown that part of myself. I was a little worried it would stick out. And so I didn't share that part of myself. And it was a real moment for me that I decided at that point, I would take the job full time, but I would come back and I would try to show up as my true self. And what I found in doing that, I don't know, I had a lot of friends I worked with, and particularly when I started drawing the cartoons, they all thought I was going to get fired for it. Like, they thought it was just a matter of time before I would, like, ruffle some feathers and get fired. And it was a big hierarchical place. And but I was like, if I get fired for this, then it's the wrong environment for me. So I just kept doing it. And I got a call one day from the assistant to the chief marketing officer. And it was very hierarchical, and we did not interact. Like, that was too many levels above to have a real interaction. And she was like, this chief marketing officer wants to see you. Are you available, this afternoon? I was like, okay. And so I was like, wow, you guys are right. I'm out of here. And but I show up to the meeting, and he said, I just saw your cartoons. I want to get to know you better. I love what you're doing. I love that you're saying this about where we are and how we work. And I think it's important. And I found that, my initial thought is that playing it safe would be the way to go. But actually, by sticking my neck out a little bit, I ended up getting promoted more rapidly. I raised my visibility. I was able to be a stronger leader, and I was just happier inside than how I'd been when I was just trying to fit in all the time. And that was just my personal story. But over time, as I got more experience with larger organizations, I think that sometimes, companies want to be more innovative. They want to get fresher thinking. They want to, but a lot of the message that they send, either overtly or subvertly, is to keep your head down and play it safe. And you end up, I think you lose your best creative thinking that way.
And how can we challenge that loss of creative thinking? How, if someone's a leader in an organization and some of what you're saying resonates, we've talked a little bit about the use of humor, but more generally, how can we try and keep organizations creative? What would be your advice?
I think, I talked earlier about the idea of holding up the mirror. It's a little bit the emperor has no clothes type of thing. I think whether it's humor or some other way, finding a way to kind of be honest about here's what's happening right now. Because I feel like I definitely have worked in places, and I've been involved in organizations where it's just, there's not a comfort level to do that. And I think if there's any sort of leadership role to set the tone, it can have ripple effects. There's an executive I've kind of studied named Hiroki Asai, who was at Apple for a long time. He used to challenge himself. He ran quite a large division within Apple, and his big challenge was to try to make, in every all hands meeting, try to make everybody laugh at least once. And it goes back to humor, but for him, that was sort of one tone. And his quote that I always liked is that fear kills creativity, and humor is our most powerful tool to drive fear out of the system. And so as an executive within Apple, he saw, fear as the antithesis of creativity. So how do you take away some of that fear? How do you do that? And sometimes in most of the experience that I've come across, executives don't mean to create an environment of fear. They're not trying to do it, but I think you have to actively take steps to try to take that out of the system. In his case, he would create these funny videos that he would have people on his team who are humorous film about their office environment and their culture. And he would play that at the start of his all hand meetings and get a good collective laugh. And so again, he's not a stand-up comedian, but he's acting a bit as a culture tone setter. He's sort of acting as a curator, trying to bring that up, bring his team together. And I love that example.
That's brilliant. We've talked quite a lot about humor in a corporate setting. I'd be really intrigued about your views on humor more broadly. Here at Marketing Kind, we talk about a huge range of topics, from environment to trying to get volunteers on board, all sorts of things like that. Are there any examples that you're aware of where humor as a communication tool can help some of our broader societal issues?
Yeah, I think the same way of holding up a mirror is really powerful. I mean, to get people to engage with issues, to care about issues,
yes,
and to talk about some of the obstacles that can get in the way of any objective. Whatever it is, like if you're trying to accomplish something, there are obstacles. And and sometimes the obstacles are unspoken. And so finding humor as a way to point at some of the obstacles that get in the way, I think can be a really productive enabler to kind of move past them. I find now on the projects I work on with organizations, about 2/3 of them are for external marketing, but about 1/3 increasingly are kind of internal blockers. And those I find really interesting. I had a chance to work with a large bank in Southeast Asia a few years ago, and they were a big bank and they were trying to think more entrepreneurially. They tried that was the real motivation, and they realized that some of the cultural blockers were getting in the way. And so a lot of it was just defining what those cultural blockers were. They were working with an agency who had they have this analogy. They called them, the acronym they used were BEANS: behavior enablers, artifacts, and nudges. And their idea was like, if you create some artifacts and nudges, some little artifacts that show, here's some of the blockers getting in the way of our corporation, our corporate culture, and we talk about them openly, then we can kind of find a way to move past them. And so they brought me in because they thought that cartoons could be a type of artifact or nudge. And so I had this fun experience, like sitting in with an organization, hearing what was getting in the way, and then trying to create cartoons to kind of represent some of those blockers. And then they ended up using those within their, quite a large organization, like 100,000 people who worked there. Different, team leaders would have a set of cartoons and some other artifacts, and they would lead small sessions within their groups to talk about, okay, here's what's standing in the way. They try to get some laughter around it and then talk about ways to approach it a little bit differently.
Makes sense. I think earlier you talked about kind of humor as a real, I suppose, bonding piece. And I think actually scientifically there's research proven that if you laugh with someone, you are more emotionally connected to them. How do you see that as a tool for helping us solve problems internally, externally? How does that growth of what role can humor play in collaboration, and how can that then help us solve some of those issues that you've just discussed?
Yeah, I think ultimately the biggest issues have to take collaboration, because no one person has all the answers. So finding a way to it's one of the things I like about that cartoon caption contest I do sometimes, because I love seeing what people come back with, because it's usually one visual, but everybody, if you have a room of 100 people, everybody sees something a little bit differently in that. And they come up with something funny in the situation that's uniquely a bit of them. It's participatory. There's the situation that's drawn, and they bring their own experience to it. And I love that exercise as a metaphor for, I think, how collaboration works in organizations, that everybody sees a situation a little bit differently. And if you have an environment that's conducive to everybody sharing what they see, and not feeling like, oh, I don't want to say that because I don't want to stick out, or what if other people aren't seeing the same thing, you end up with a kind of a reduced diversity of ideas. Gotcha. And you're going to miss the big breakthroughs. You're going to miss the big opportunities. And I saw that time and time again in organizations I worked with, where if you had a culture that was conducive to people, who might be otherwise shy, even bringing their idea forward, if they could feel comfortable doing that, the ideas are going to be stronger. I worked on a product development exercise a few years ago, and we had this cultural thing at Method we called the wiki wall. And the idea was that there are all these floor to ceiling magnetic whiteboards around the office. And anytime we were trying to do something like, go against this particular challenge or launch this new product or whatever, we would just dedicate a wiki wall to it. And the rules of the wiki wall is that everybody in the whole company, even if you didn't work in that business or that particular silo, you were encouraged to add to it, to add ideas. And so there'd be some challenge at the top of it, and then people would add ideas. And I loved seeing what came from parts of the organization that just weren't usually part of it. I remember one project, somebody who was in the accounting group, but happened to have a family horse ranch. She came in one day with a bunch of horse suppositories from the horse ranch. And she thought, I thought this could be an interesting form factor for this type of laundry detergent. And that went on the wiki wall. And it was great. I loved it. Was just like an example of nonlinear thinking and somebody approaching it based on her unique worldview. And it sparked ideas, and people added to that and built on that. And so I feel like that's a good, metaphorically, I think we all could use wiki walls in our office environments to allow people to feel comfortable being collaborative, when you're bringing ideas to life, and trying to break down some of the walls that can happen.
I think we should all be setting those up. Humor can often also be quite helpful as a coping mechanism. If, I don't know, we're in the office or we're somewhere else, or we get some really bad news, or we have this really big problem. Do you see that humor can play a role there in helping us assess, understand the problem and get past it?
Wait, say that last part again. I'm sorry, the audio broke up for a second.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me? How can humor be a coping mechanism? How can it help us cope with a bad day, find an obstacle and get past it?
I think a lot of it is seeing that you're not alone. It became sort of this this trite thing during early COVID. We're all in this together. Kind of used it over and over again. But I think there was something, when you see a powerful, when you're going through something and you realize you're not the only one going through it, I think actually is powerful. So having some humor, I think we rely on that to get through things, to feel like we're not alone in it. And I feel like, I don't know, I think there are other ways to do it besides humor, but humor is a great way to show that, hey, this is a situation we're all collectively going through.
Amazing. And do you ever feel like, do you use humor in your day-to-day life beyond cartoons? And is there ever any time when you use humor and either it doesn't land or it lands how you're not quite expecting?
Well, having teenage daughters, they will tell you that I'm often not very funny at all. I have my dad jokes do not get quite the response that I would hope that they would. So but I find I don't know, my style of humor, because I work with cartoons and it's a slow process. I'm not an improv comic. For me, I like the craft of cartoons because you sit and think with it and reflect on it. And it takes a long time to create a cartoon. Is quite a long process before I kind of put it out there. And I really like that. It's very meditative in a way. So that's just the style that I sort of gravitate to. In my regular life, I like humor, but it often takes the form of sharing things that other people have come up with that's quite funny. And so I find that it's much like I've heard described, if you want to be interesting, be interested. I think my approach to humor is that way. I like, if I want to have more humor in my own life, I want to be on the lookout for things that I find funny. And so that's kind of the approach that I always take. And having teenagers in a different generation has been, it's great for me because I see what they find funny and they share things with me. And we have a great, there's a lot of laughter in our house, which is great, even if the laughter is making fun of me for my bad sense of humor.
Would you ever kind of, whether it's in a corporate setting, consider humor a bit of a high risk strategy? Have you, can it ever go wrong? And I know you talked a little bit about types of humor earlier, but any advice you'd give to make it get all those lovely payoffs and benefits you've spoken about without some of the potential downside that people might be nervous about?
Yeah, I think it's, it obviously, I first went into this thinking, well, there's some topics that might be hard to bring humor into. And strangely, I've found, like in the various clients I've worked with, some of the areas that I thought might have the biggest kind of, potential for misstep. In some ways, if you bring that affiliative type of humor into those situations, there's some of the projects that have actually had the biggest impact. I've done a lot of projects with HR, with people working in HR. I've done a lot of projects with people in legal fields. And there was like, you want to thread a needle, and there are things that we just want to be really careful and sensitive to. Yeah. But when you're successful at threading that needle, it's amazing how impactful it is, and how like there's just a real appetite for it, because it's so often not there. My recent largest campaign that just launched is a global law firm, and there are all sorts of issues that they were going after, and law issues and related to all sorts of things, and finding the right way to thread the needle has been part of the fun challenge of it all. So I would say in the same way that joining an organization and sometimes the temptation is to self-edit, my thought is generally, the bar is really low. So even if you're only mildly humorous in a particular situation, and you have the right sensitivity around it, it's going to stand out, and that in a positive way. And so the big watchword I would say is just avoid aggressive humor in the workplace. That's the biggest thing. But but look for, and this is where I think humor can be an act of empathy. Look for moments to be empathetic. Look for people in the organization who you work with. Have empathy for what you're all going through together, and talk about those, and finding, and if you're playing in that sandbox, then I think that alleviates the vast majority of the risks that I've seen.
Very wise words. So I'm gonna hand over very shortly to the broader group for questions. I will just, while you're coming up with some excellent questions for Tom, I will just share a few of Tom's favorite cartoons that he picked out. I will attempt to share. There we go. We need to stay focused on our marketing priorities and not get distracted by every shiny new look, squirrel.
That's one I actually have on the wall. These two I actually have kind of framed in my office. I like these personally a lot.
Careful, the last content was full of marketing. Digital transformation is years away. I don't see our company having to change anytime soon. So let's stop.
Yeah, that last one went ridiculously viral. Like, it's been interesting to see which cartoons land and which ones don't, but that last one, for whatever reason, I drew it in the start of COVID, and I think even set aside the digital transformation point, I think the idea of being hit viscerally by a wrecking ball seemed to resonate with people, and I've got a lot of. It's funny, I've updated that cartoon for speaking events, and most recently I updated the wrecking ball to say Chat GPT on it. I feel like in the world of marketing in particular, like, it's a nonstop stream of wrecking balls we have to somehow take into account and figure out how to adjust. And I don't know, that's a bit of a metaphor for, I think, the role of humor too, is that who knows what's going to come next month. And and I in a way, I've always thought of these cartoons as a bit of a diary that I've kept in my time in marketing, and who, it's endlessly exciting and interesting, and sometimes frustrating, and can make you a little bit spin out. And so I like finding humor in those areas, because it touches on that we're all going through it together and trying to make sense of this world that we're working in.